Friends, welcome. My name is Max Grinnell, and I'm the author of a number of books about Chicago, and I also teach urban studies. I'm here with you for the One Book, One Chicago 2020 program year. In the past, if you've come to my talks or walks around the city, we've talked about culinary history, demographics, the built environment, and a range of other subjects. In this talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Chicago's response to new arrivals during the 19th century. As some of you know, the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago experienced fantastical growth during this time period. People from New England, Germany, Ireland, the American South, and other places arrived to make the city their own. Of course, some found a more warmer welcome than others, and that's part of our conversation here today. Of course, if we expanded into the 20th century, there would be a lot more different groups and transitions to talk about, but keeping my remarks to the 19th century gives us a chance to see how some of those early trends would influence what happened later throughout the city and beyond. So thank you for joining me, and we'll go ahead and start talking a little bit about some of these transformations. First, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. For those of you who may not be familiar with the idea of a land acknowledgement, it's a formal statement that recognizes and respects indigenous people as traditional stewards of this land and their enduring influence on the region. It's something that a lot of organizations, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Newberry Library, the City of Chicago, and other organizations have started to do over the years. And I'll begin by telling you a little bit about the people who used to dominate this region. Chicago is located on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Other tribes such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox have also called this place home. And while we may not have many of their firsthand recollections available to us, we do realize that they remain a powerful and important influence throughout the region. Probably most people watching this talk, if you're from Chicago or spent time in the city, you've walked across the Michigan Avenue Bridge. But of course, it's not actually the Michigan Avenue Bridge. It's the Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable Bridge. This magnificent piece of architecture, which celebrates its 100th anniversary in 2020, was named to recognize the accomplishments and achievements of the first permanent settler of Chicago. DuSable was born in Haiti in 1745, and he is truly thought of as the first permanent, non-indigenous person to live in what we now know as the city. So it's important to think about his long-term legacy and all the things that he gave and offered to the region. Certainly more organizations in the last 20 or so years have begun to acknowledge all of his important accomplishments and achievements as we think about Chicago as a fantastically diverse place. The historical recollections of DuSable are offered up by a number of different groups, and certainly there are some facts that we know for certain about his life. His father was a French sailor, some sources say a pirate, and his mother an enslaved African. By the time he arrived in what we now know as Chicago in 1770, he had built a trading post at the mouth of the local river where the Tribune Tower now stands. DuSable also offered a lot of firsts throughout the city of Chicago. He was the first person to have a granary in Chicago. He was the first person to engage in food production in the city of Chicago. So in a very real way, DuSable offered a lot of Chicago's first that became powerful and important parts of the region's history. There are a lot of things we still don't know about DuSable's time in and around Chicago. We do know that in the year 1800, he abruptly sold most of his holdings. We are not entirely sure why this happened. He farmed near Peoria for about 10 years or so until his wife died. Then he moved to Missouri to be with his daughter in the town of St. Charles. Other than that, there's still a lot that we still do not know about this most important man. We do have important accounts of his physical countenance. He was described as a handsome man, a man of great stature. So we do have some physical descriptions of DuSable, but not a lot else to go on. But certainly as we think of this idea and concept of new arrivals in what we now call Chicago, DuSable's legacy looms large. And of course, in recent years, along with some of the other tributes and memorials that I've spoken about, is a bust of his head that sits immediately north of the Chicago River on the east side of Michigan Avenue. I invite you to go see this bust of this most remarkable man. So in a very real way, DuSable is part of this long-standing legacy of new arrivals. If you think about the early to mid-19th century throughout what we now know as Chicago, many of the people who arrived were from New England and New York. It makes sense that if you were looking for new business opportunities, commercial trading opportunities, the promise of free or low-cost land, that coming to a place like Chicago would be a pretty good fit for folks. And come they certainly did. Thousands of people came from Massachusetts, Vermont, upstate New York, and New Hampshire to make a new life in the city of Chicago. And there are many people I could have picked from New England. I've tried to pick out a few people that really represent some of the more interesting trends in the early 19th century. And certainly they are the kind of new arrivals that lent their name to new business ventures, streets, and landscapes that we still think of throughout the city. One of these people we're looking at right now is Gordon Hubbard Saltonstall. Saltonstall is a kind of a Mayflower name, if you will. It's certainly one of those names that people think of when they think of old, established families of New England. And Gordon was one of those people who was distantly related to the more famous branch of that family. Now, Hubbard came when he was 18, and of all years, 1818, to the city of Chicago, and he was a native of Woodstock, Vermont. He was another one of these people who came to work, interestingly enough, in the fur trade. Obviously, the fur trade had exploded by this time throughout the region. There was heavy demand for the use of pelts in all manner of clothing and other type of accoutrements. Now, the fur trade started to peter out by the time that Saltonstall had been here for a number of years. And he began to start a number of businesses that would rise to fame throughout the city. Certainly, Hubbard was an innovator in a lot of different ways. We probably think of meat packing as one of Chicago's most dominant industries in the 19th and first half of the 20th century. Well, Hubbard started the first meat packing plant in Chicago. He helped create the Chicago Board of Trade and the Union Stockyards, and he also built the first brick commercial building. So Saltonstall, in a really real way, was one of these people who started a lot of the things that we now associate with Chicago's rapid growth and development. He was also the first insurance underwriter in the city, and he also started a steamship that crossed over Lake Michigan. The interesting thing about Saltonstall's legacy was the fact that his name, or one of his names, Hubbard, is now attached to many things throughout the city. Some of them more positive than others. If you ever walk down Hubbard Street, that's part of his legacy. If you've ever been stuck in your car in Hubbard's Cave, I guess that's also probably maybe a less positive legacy of his name. But it's very much part of the city's identity, even to this day. The next slide shows us Hubbard's Folly. This is a plaque that reads as follows. On this site, about 1834, Gordon S. Hubbard built Chicago's first warehouse for storing pork and other pioneer produce. Because of its size and substantial construction, early skeptics called the building Hubbard's Folly. So, you have all these things. If you think about things in the 19th century, like people referring to the purchase of Alaska as Seward's Folly, this folly, that folly. Hubbard was really one of these people who knew early on that he could create something to really transform the city. So in a lot of ways, he was a kind of a trailblazer, if you will, with this work. Hubbard wasn't alone, of course. There were many other new arrivals from throughout New England that continued to change the city in this time period. One of my kind of, I won't say favorites, but certainly one of the people who's always intrigued me has been William Ogden. Of course, his name is attached to a street and other things that maybe some of you have driven on. Maybe you've been stuck in traffic on Ogden Avenue. Ogden was the first mayor of the city of Chicago, and he later acquired the nickname the Astor of Chicago because for a time he was the city's richest citizen. So where was Ogden from? Ogden was born in 1805 in Walton, New York. So he was a son of the Empire State, and he was also someone who was very interested in creating new business opportunities. There was a hard time when he first arrived in the city, kind of getting started, but he's one of these people who was able to create a number of businesses during his lifetime that influenced the city's development for well over a century. And I want to tell you a little bit about both of those. Certainly one of the most well-known and celebrated achievements that Ogden did was a number of city infrastructure improvements, cleaning up the streets, the roadways, the sidewalks, really the kind of stuff of what makes a city work. So there's certainly kind of that leading interest in what we now refer to as infrastructure, which, as we all know, is kind of a big deal when you think about how cities work. One of William Ogden's major interests was railroads. After serving as the city's first mayor, he decided to create his own railroad, and he was having trouble getting money from folks back east. So he reached out to his partner, J. Young Scammon, and they decided to contact farmers and small business people throughout the hinterlands of Chicago who would be interested in subscribing and helping out their railroad company grow. And he had great success. By 1848, Ogden and Scammon had raised $350,000, and they were able to start laying track between Chicago and Galena. Some might say, why Galena? At the time, Galena was known for its lead mines, so it seemed like a logical endpoint. And of course, there were a lot of farms and other businesses along the way that would help continue to pay for the railroad's growth. So it was kind of a master stroke when you think about it. And Ogden and Scammon were pretty bright investors as they continued to think about how this business might grow over time. And obviously, if you think about what dominates Chicago throughout the 19th century, along with the arrival of immigrants from all over, it's certainly the development of a very extensive railroad system. And interestingly enough, the first railroad station, our first fixed passenger railroad station in the city of Chicago, which you see here in this slide, was the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad. Interesting story, this building is today at the intersection of Canal and Kinsey. The building has been gone for a very long time, and it is still a surface parking lot right now. Though undoubtedly, in the coming years, maybe decades, someone will put a new skyscraper up on this site. If you're familiar with all the activity that's been going on there in the last 10 years or so, certainly this would be a great place for a new tall building. We've heard about two prominent New Englanders so far, William B. Ogden and Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard. The last one I'd like to add into the mix, and one whose name continues to be very well known, even if his landmark department store is no longer, is Marshall Field. And if you think about philanthropists in the 19th century and the early 20th century, Marshall Field was one of these people who changed the retail merchandising game forever with his window displays, his noted aphorisms about the customer is always right, so on and so forth. But his backstory involves retail and farming in western Massachusetts. Marshall Field got to Chicago, or arrived in Chicago in 1856, and he was 21 years old. And he immediately began working at the firm of Cooley, Wadsworth and Company. By the Civil War, Field was a partner in this company. And then after the Civil War, he joined two other well-known names in Chicago, Levi Leiter and Potter Palmer, to create a new dry goods house, the name of which was Field, Palmer, Leiter and Company. Potter Palmer left the firm in 1867, and the name became Field, Leiter and Company. The scale of this operation was the thing that Marshall Field's ingenuity brought to bear on Chicago's retail landscape. And the transformation cannot be underestimated, and it's really all about scale, scale, scale. In the 1860s, they were doing almost $10 million of wholesale and retail business. It's a tremendous sum of money and really represents the fact that they were able to reach out to so many consumers through their catalogs, their increased bricks and mortar retail presence, and so on. By the late 1880s, the firm sales had risen to over $30 million. A tremendous amount of money when you think about it. And really the fact that they're able to change all of these major ways that people bought things was part of this tremendous transformation of the city in the 19th century. And it also opened the door for other folks. Immigrants from Poland, like the Goldblatt brothers, the Wiebolt store, and so many other diverse companies that were really part of the city's retail landscape. They began to give the city part of its flavor. Even today, if you walk up and down Michigan Avenue, what do a lot of people come to Chicago to do? They come to shop. They come to buy things. They take it home to family members. They send it out as presents. So really, this modest man from Berkshire County in Massachusetts was part of this great transformation, along with people like William Ogden, along with people like Gordon Saltonstall Hubbard. They really were these people who began to transform some of this retail environment and also some of this booster environment. They really started to create a new path forward for the city of Chicago. They were just a few men, though. Soon these folks, well, you know, they would be joined by thousands of other people. I want to say a quick word about this slide as well, too, just to think of how passionately people thought about Marshall Field's store. And something that I remember firsthand, and maybe a lot of you remember as well quite vividly, was the protest when Marshall Fields became Macy's. And of course, this is one of those large dramatic protests where people come up and down with these signs that said, "Fields is Chicago, boycott Macy's." And all I can tell people is, when it comes to big cities, everything is always changing. So I always thought it was interesting that people kind of pick this moment to say, here we are, we recognize the importance of Marshall Fields, and for this to change is a key transformation in the city of Chicago. And of course, if you know anything about how State Street has been doing, or kind of the situation in the Loop over the last few months, I would hazard to guess that eventually Macy's will also close. And what will go into Macy's? That is the million-dollar question. What you're looking at is the location of the Illinois-Michigan Canal. Today in 2020, the Illinois-Michigan Canal is used, what remains of it is used for leisure. People have picnics on its banks. You'll find a few historic landmarks and plaques along its route. And today it's, you know, it's an important part of the state's history. And it's also an important part of the state's transportation economy. The movement of goods, and we'll see how the movement of goods and the need to create this place where goods could move effectively led to an influx of many new arrivals from Ireland. As you can see, the Illinois-Michigan Canal, which starts in the city of Chicago and ends in LaSalle County, was part of this transformation. It was part of the reason that Chicago had its first great immigration of new arrivals from Ireland. Certainly in 2020, we are familiar with the ways in which Irish culture is expressed, from St. Patrick's Day, the parade, the celebration of music, folk dancing, literature, poetry, and the other ways that we think about Irishness in the city of Chicago. And in the 1830s, vast numbers of Irishmen started arriving to work on the Illinois and Michigan Canal. In fact, the neighborhood that we now know as Bridgeport was once referred to as Hardscrabble. And of course, the Illinois-Michigan Canal went through these communities. It was a lot of hard labor. They literally needed thousands of hands on deck to create all of the infrastructure for the Illinois-Michigan Canal. So you see this linkage that we experience in the 20th and 21st century, which is large number of immigrants and new arrivals to work in different industries. And of course, the question for all of us in the 21st century, whether they are immigrants or not, is what happens when we no longer need all these people to do these different jobs? That's a $10 million question, and one we probably won't answer in today's talk. So between the time the Illinois-Michigan Canal construction started in 1836 and 1845, thousands of Irish people arrived in Chicago. Some of them were coming for work. Some of them were seeking economic opportunity, right? These are some of what historians and other folks call the pull factors. There are also notably a number of push factors. Probably most people are familiar with the fact that Ireland had tremendous potato crop failures starting in 1845, which essentially was a type of super accelerant to people leaving Ireland, looking for new jobs, a new way of life, a better way of life. And of course, as a result of these famines, over 1.5 million people would eventually leave Ireland. It's a tremendous number of people, and many of them coming to Chicago. And as a side note, I'll also observe that Chicago's Irish-born population actually peaked in 1900 with a total of 73,000 persons. So you have this huge push starting in the middle of the 19th century, lasting all the way up until the early 20th century, arrivals from Ireland. And certainly they affected great change in the city's cultural, economic, and social landscape. What were the types of things that they experienced along the way? And there's a good example of folks laboring out here on the Illinois-Michigan Canal. This is taken from a engraving that appeared in Harper's Magazine. So you get a sense of the vast number of people out there working on the boats and traveling to work sites. The reception was not always a welcome one. Certainly Irish people had an advantage over other groups in that they spoke English, and in some ways this allowed them to easily assimilate into Chicago's existing cultural landscape. Right here we have a picture of St. Bridget's Church, and that's also a nice example of how Irish people chose to be incorporated into the city's religious landscape. Certainly one of the issues, and we'll talk about that in the next few minutes, is that many Irish arrivals were Roman Catholic. And there was a strong distrust in some quarters of people of the Catholic faith, and something that would come to a head in the creation of the Know Nothing Party, the nativist movement. And again, it's not so hard for us to see in the 21st century where we see some of the roots of anti-immigration thought and political discussion. This is a very famous, celebrated cartoon by Thomas Nast from 1876 that tells a little bit about some of the prejudices that Irish and Irish Americans faced as they made their way through immigrating to large American cities, Chicago included. And you can see down at the bottom it says, "The American River Ganges." And there are the Catholic bishops, which appear as a type of crocodile or massive reptile coming to attack what the editorial was referring to, which is the public school system in the United States. So, you know, it seems a little unusual to our sensibilities, or possibly to our sensibilities in 2020, but the idea was that these Irish Catholics, their first allegiance was not to the United States of America, not to the political or other traditions, but rather to the Pope in Rome. So the idea that, like, where was your allegiance really based? And of course, I don't need to tell you that in the 21st century, we still find a lot of these challenges and problems. Friends, we're looking at Chicago, the Wonder City by EUGEN, SEEGER, a German. It's a really wonderful book from 1893 that talks about Chicago's history in the 19th century. It's told from a German's point of view. And if you're interested, you can go to the Internet Archive, archive.org, and look at the entire thing in German or English. It's really a testament to both the city's growth and also Eugene SEEGER's love of the city. And of course, this is a nice segue for us to talk about the German influence in Chicago. Another group that, like the Irish, had tremendous success in the economic landscape, the cultural landscape, but also faced a number of challenges as their numbers grew. And that's something that you find a lot throughout any major city, Chicago included, is that as these numbers remain small, usually people are welcoming and mostly accommodating. But as numbers start to get larger, people start to look sometimes askance at these new arrivals, whether they are German, Irish, people of Hispanic descent, and so on. So something, again, that we should be mindful, especially in 2020. Between 1820 and 1930, over 5.9 million Germans came to the United States. And of course, not all 5.9 million of them came to Chicago, but certainly their population continued to increase and grow exponentially and grow in large measure after the Civil War. Certainly Chicago by the 1840s and 1850s had a sizable German population. Some of them had come because of the promise of religious tolerance, and of course that's how we get groups in places like Pennsylvania and other large eastern cities, and then many of them continued to move west to cities like Chicago. And actually, by 1850, the German population constituted 1/6 of Chicago's population. So really a staggering number when you think about it, almost 20%. And interestingly enough, by 1900, there were 470,000 Chicagoans, essentially 1 out of every 4 residents, had either been born in Germany or had a parent born there. By 1920, the numbers of Germans in the city of Chicago had dropped, largely because of reduced immigration from Germany, but also because it had become unpopular to acknowledge a German heritage. And part of my own personal history is that 2 of my relatives who came from Germany spent almost a decade in Chicago, working and living. Germans were able to find success in many different types of economic endeavors. And of course, if you think about life in Chicago or life in any large capitalist society, you have to work to eat, right? You have to have a job, you have to have a trade, you have to be employed by the government. Something has to kind of happen in this fashion for you to continue what you like to do. And certainly an occupation that's commonly associated with Germans and German Americans is the production of beer. And we're looking here at a wonderful historic American building survey photo from the Library of Congress, thank you Library of Congress, of the Schoenhofen Brewing Complex. And this is down at 18th and Canalport, and it's actually a historic landmark district. And it's interesting to think about Peter Schoenhofen's success in his time as a brewer. He actually arrived in Chicago in the 1850s and started working in the brewing trade almost immediately. In 1861, he started a partnership with Matthias Gottfried, and they were soon operating the brewery that you see in front of you. Certainly not these exact structures, but this is the location from which it all started. In 1867, Schoenhofen bought out his partner, and the company became formally known as the Peter Schoenhofen Brewing Company. By 1868, the annual output had increased to about 10,000 barrels. And by the 1890s, the annual output was over 180,000 barrels. It will probably not surprise any of you to learn, and particularly on our own pandemic moment, that drinking alcohol is very popular. And certainly Germans were very successful, both in terms of expanding their own product and creating new customers, and also experiencing what they would call Gemütlichkeit, or congeniality, around the practice of drinking with other people in some of the beer gardens around the city, in some of the saloons and taverns. It really was meant as a social activity. Of course, there were some who looked askance at immigrants and their drinking practices, their success in the business, and so on. And they attracted some unwelcome attention. Which leads me to talk a little bit about what some have called the Lager beer riot. Now, it seems funny that we would think about fighting over the production and sale of beer, but if we look at different moments in America's historical past, Prohibition, recent conversations during our own pandemic times about which businesses should be open. If you're a bar or tavern that doesn't sell food, should you be allowed to still be open? So once again, it's fairly easy to make some of these connections as we think and reflect on what we're experiencing in our own time. The beer riot occurred on April 21st, 1855. There was a long buildup to this process as people have become exasperated and upset as part of these changes and transformation. Now, the mayor at the time was Levi Boone, who was a capital and nativist politician. He was one who looked askance at many of these new groups of immigrants. Who are these people? What are they doing here? Why have they come? He renewed enforcement of an old local ordinance which said that taverns be closed on Sundays. Now, for a lot of people, if you didn't work 5 days a week, you work 6 days a week. Some people work 7 days a week. But the one day given over to rest, religious practice, and other activities, leisure activities notably, was Sunday. So essentially, he was saying you couldn't gather on this one time period. You might be able to spend time with family, friends, and other people. Now, the city council raised the cost of a liquor license from $50 per year to $300 per year. And it seemed like the German-American community was being targeted because of this. People were socializing on this Sunday, as I mentioned. If you couldn't be open on Sunday, when could you be expected to celebrate? And of course, there was a long-standing precedent about this because Mayor Boone had even mentioned in his inauguration speech the following: I cannot be blind to the existence in our midst of a powerful politico-religious organization, all its members owing and its chief officers bound under an oath of allegiance to the temporal as well as the spiritual supremacy of a foreign despot. Boone had run on an anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic platform of the Know Nothing Party. So it wasn't so surprising when he said, well, we're going to look into changing these rules about when people can drink beer. And of course, this riot, which was fairly quickly quelled, we have an illustration of it. Obviously, a little bit of a stylized interpretation with all the chairs and everyone running amok and people grabbing for shoulders and necks and probably getting a punch or two in there. You can understand why people would be upset. People saying, well, we're going to take away some of your leisure activities. The aftermath of the riot was that the price of the license was reduced again and order was restored. But this certainly was one of these moments where something that was ostensibly about beer was really about a more broader change within Chicago's cultural landscape. And it's an important moment for us to remember. Germans and German Americans had many other successes throughout the city. As many other groups did, African Americans, Irish Americans, and other people, they formed certain tightly knit, spatially proximate ethnic enclaves. This is a picture of the Jondorf block at the corner of North and Halsted. By the 1880s, North Avenue in this section of Chicago was known as the German Broadway. And of course, if you proceed east down North Avenue to Clark and North, you can find the Germania Club and other large social gathering spaces. The Jondorf block is probably one of my favorite buildings in the entire city of Chicago. It was built in 1887 by the Jondorf brothers to serve as a meeting hall for the various German social organizations throughout Lincoln Park. And of course, if you've ever been on the brown or purple lines, you're familiar with the fact that the L so eloquently bends around this wonderful structure. And its robust presence reminds us of how much buildings like these would mean to members of the German community. It was a place to gather. It was a place to celebrate. It was a place where you knew you were welcome. It would be okay to speak the German language. And it was really a tremendous building. And I'll close by noting that the architect was Frederick Allschlager. And if you spend some time looking up at this building, you'll be able to see some of its wonderful terracotta details, and its really tremendous metal cornice. It's really a place that you can sit and look up at and get a sense of what it'd be like to be part of this community. You know, one of the things that we've talked about a little bit so far in this talk is the explosive nature of bringing so many different groups of people together, and the wonderful nature of it. I use explosive in the most positive sense, and certainly the city of Chicago, not only growing so quickly during the mid and late 19th century, meant that lots of groups would come into conflict. There were conflicts about ideas, the relationship between labor management and laborers. And of course, famously, all of this quite literally exploded in what we now refer to as the Haymarket Affair. And it really brought into question, what would we do and how would we incorporate not just new arrivals, but how would we begin to think about new ideologies, new ways of being in the world, political manners of thought. And once again, these are conversations that we are still having in 2020, and we will continue to have in the future. Some of the main facts of the Haymarket Affair are very well known. I'll give you a short summary of the events of that day that are so dramatically illustrated in this portrait you have in front of you. On May 1st, 1886, Chicago Unionists, reformers, socialists, anarchists, and ordinary workers combined to make the city the center of the national movement for an 8-hour day. The ability to just have to work 8 hours a day. Between April 25th and May 4th, workers attended scores of meetings and paraded through the streets at least 19 times. On Saturday, May 1st, 35,000 workers walked off their jobs. Tens of thousands more, both skilled and unskilled, joined them on May 3rd and 4th. Crowds traveled from workplace to workplace, urging fellow workers to strike. Many of them adopted the radical idea of 8 hours work for 10 hours pay. So there were even those who thought that we should go further in this quest for better labor conditions and pay. Many of the exact facts of the events at the Haymarket in May of 1886 remain a mystery, despite the fact that there has been much historical research about this event. There is still much that we do not know. What we do know is that this dramatic affair did lead to an increased class consciousness about the rights of labor and also about the rights of immigrants as part of this labor movement. And of course, these are conversations that we are still having at this time. So the Haymarket Affair is really a stand-in for a lot of broader conversations that we are still having. Of course, if you're familiar with the Fight for 15 movement among fast food workers, if you think about the way that Service Employees International Union, or SEIU, continues to draw on its many immigrant and second-generation workers to affect meaningful change throughout the workplace environment, a lot of this can be directly traced to the Haymarket Affair. So it's a pivotal moment in 19th century Chicago history, and really a pivotal moment for immigrants in the workforce as part of this broader conversation. And of course, throughout the weeks and months following the actual Haymarket incident, there are many weekly publications, periodicals, newspapers, journals that publish dramatic accounts of those events. And there you have those 8 individuals who are referred to as the anarchists of Chicago. That was certainly one of the words that came up a lot in describing a lot of these people and attaching them to not only the fact that many of them were immigrants, but also the idea that they were inherently linked with creating anarchy in the United States. We would be remiss if we didn't talk in the 19th century about the arrivals of African Americans in Chicago. While many people may be familiar with the Great Migration period in Chicago, certainly the arrival of more African Americans in the middle of the 19th century led to a dramatic change in the city's cultural and social landscape. We're looking right now at a photograph of John Jones. John Jones was an African American who had many firsts during his lifetime. He was the first black man in the state of Illinois to serve on a grand jury, the first notary public, and the first to be elected to public office in 1871. His accomplishments are many, and he also led a personal campaign to end the black codes of Illinois, and he would also become Chicago's wealthiest and most influential African American throughout the entire 19th century. Jones was born in Green City, North Carolina in 1816, and for most of his early life, he was an indentured servant who trained as a tailor in Memphis. In the 1840s, or specifically in 1845, he arrived with his wife with only $2 in his pocket. Over that time, he was befriended by several abolitionists, Lemuel Covell Payne and Dr. Charles Dyer, who helped him learn how to read and write, and also, more importantly, taught him the fundamentals of business and real estate. Now, during Jones' lifetime, population of African Americans in Chicago was quite small. The census of 1860 records about 1,000 African Americans throughout the entire city. But certainly one of Jones' accomplishments, and one of the things that he's most notable for, is this investment in real estate. And if you think about Chicago's obsessive nature with real estate, like most big cities, it was an important germ, an important acorn, if you will, that Jones got more and more African Americans thinking about owning their own home, owning real estate, and being concerned with land values and their increase. Jones is an important part of the African American community in Chicago during this time period, and he is also truly an inspiration and a role model for other people who would like to do likewise. It's worth saying a little bit about Jones's crusade against the Illinois black laws. He started his work and petitions to repeal these laws as early as 1847. The laws or codes had been adopted in 1819 and prohibited free blacks from having legal rights, including the right to sue, testify against whites, own property, or access a public education. He first got started in this work by writing a series of columns in the Western Citizen in 1847. A few years later, he began to work closely with Frederick Douglass. In 1850, Jones circulated a petition signed by black residents of the state for Illinois legislators to repeal the black laws. It would take another 15 years for the state of Illinois to repeal their provision of its black laws. So, like many other things, a long process to get all these laws eventually repealed. By the end of the 19th century, Chicago's African American population was sizable enough that there was a distinguishing factor between older African American residents and new arrivals. And you sense this tension sometimes in many different groups of new arrivals to the city of Chicago. We are looking right here at an application for membership into the Chicago Old Settlers Club. The Old Settlers Club was formed by Ida McIntosh Dempsey, and she held the first meeting of that social club in 1902. And the idea was to celebrate the accomplishments and achievements of African Americans who had resided in the city of Chicago for some time. And of course, you sometimes will find these tensions between new arrivals and an established population. And certainly, this was one of those ways to both celebrate those achievements and also, in some ways, to differentiate between different groups of people. And interestingly enough, the Newberry Library and the Chicago Public Library have some of the records related to the Chicago Old Settlers Club. And I highly recommend spending some time to look over these materials. One of the broader transformations, and if you think about things we've mentioned today about the Irish community in Hardscrabble, which is now known as Bridgeport, the German concentrations in Lincoln Square and along North Avenue, is certainly the situation very unique that many African Americans faced in the city of Chicago, which was intense spatial and racial segregation. And this was a practice that was encoded by racist real estate covenants and policies that lasted for decades. So one rather unique situation that Chicago's African Americans faced was the fact that they were heavily restricted to certain communities. One of the most well-known of these communities is what is known as the Black Belt, predominantly African American community throughout the city's south side, stretching from 22nd to 31st Street along State Street. And of course, there were other areas that were restricted. In the 20th century, it was very well known to other parts of the South Side, such as Hyde Park, were essentially off limits for African Americans due to restrictive covenants that were written into real estate deeds. So this was a rather unique and tragic situation, and you can see in this photograph taken from the Works Progress Administration archives documenting one of these apartment buildings on the south side. This was a situation that, of course, in 2020, that the city of Chicago, through planning policies and other equitable development policies, is trying to undo the legacy of these racist policies. And of course, it goes without saying that there's still a lot of work to be done in this area. While we obviously are not talking about every single group of new arrivals, immigrants, migrants, folks coming from other parts of the United States or North America during this talk, I think it's also important as a kind of a coda to this conversation to thinking about the 19th century is to think about the role of Hull House. Probably some of you have heard of Hull House before. You're familiar with some of their work. Maybe some of you have been to the Hull House Museum on the campus of the University of Illinois at Chicago. Just as a sort of reminder, or kind of for those of you who may not remember, Hull House was founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr on the Near West Side in 1889. Jane Addams had a dominant interest in working with immigrant communities and also creating a series of social programs that would help them assimilate into American society and the city of Chicago's landscape. And of course, she was fortunate enough to have a historic mansion as kind of to start her complex out on what is now the campus of the University of Illinois at Chicago. And of course, by the early 20th century, she was serving tens of thousands of immigrants every year. And just to give you a sense of what this complex included, there was a gymnasium, a theater, an art gallery, a music school, a boys club, auditorium, cafeteria, a cooperative residence for working women, kindergarten, nursery, library, post office, and a dining room and apartments for the residential staff. So it was really, in the best possible way, a place where immigrants could receive a vast range of services. If you have to remember, too, at the end of the 19th century, the federal government was not really involved with any programs like this. It was really self-reliance, mutual aid society, and organizations such as Jane Addams Hull House that really were responsible for what we would now call delivering services. How do we help out the Italians, the Greeks, the Mexican immigrants, and other folks who are coming into this part of Chicago? And there are lots of different programs, This is an example of Greek residents from what was known as the Delta, where Blue Island, Halsted, or Blue Island met Halsted Avenue, forming kind of a little bit of a delta, or looks like a little bit of a delta. And now you can find the remnants of Greektown there. These are Greek residents performing a Greek tragedy on the stage at Hull House. So there were a lot of programs to help assimilate immigrants into the American experience, if you will. And Jane Addams tried to do that through a lot of her programs and various outreach activities. Another part of this, and something I think we probably still think about a lot today, these are a group of nattily dressed young people here for English language classes. And of course, Hull House was one of the first places to offer a vast range of English language instruction programs for new arrivals. And if you think about how we experience the world Certainly language is one of those ways. So here's a photograph of some of those folks coming to learn English. And I suppose, since we aren't talking about so much the 20th century, which is a whole nother wonderful, vibrant, exciting, upsetting, and interesting conversation, I will leave us with this kind of conversation about one of the groups, the large groups that we're not able to talk about in this particular talk, and that is Spanish-speaking arrivals from the United States and abroad. And this is a photograph of Jesus Torres with some of his work. And Jesus Torres is one of those folks who ended up in some of Hull House's art instruction programs. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Jesus' work. Jesus was born in Mexico in 1898, born into a family that had an interest in art, and his family also sold leather goods and other materials. When he was a young man in the early 1920s, him and his wife came to the United States. They first settled in Texas, and then they would eventually come to Chicago. When he found his way to Chicago, he was working in railroad construction. And by this time, in the late 1920s, he was able to enroll in some of the art classes at the Jane Addams Settlement House. And he would work along some of his other fellow Mexican immigrants, such as Miguel Juarez, Jose Ruiz, and Hilarion Tinoco. So I think Jesus Torres' story about how he came to Chicago and how he came to Hull House is also part of the other exciting experiences that one could have at this, what was essentially a social service organization, which was not only different types of uplifting experiences, but it was also a way of being in the world and thinking about our own aesthetic experiences. And Jesus went on to a lot of tremendous accomplishments throughout the city of Chicago. In 1936, he was selected as a primary artist assistant in the development of the Carl Street Studios in Old Town on Burton Place. He designed those interiors and the ceramic tile design of the home, and along with the carved doors and copper crown. Here, Jesus became part of another part of Chicago's art scene, and really, some of this work started at Hull House. And he would go on to design interior spaces throughout the city for department stores, bakeries, decorative objects, including jewelry, and other pieces of decorative pottery. And so for Jesus, like a lot of other folks who came before and after him, this social service organization, this Hull House, was a place for him to get a start, get a new sense of his own abilities, gather some new artistic skills, and then go out and transform the world around him. And I think that's something important to remember here in 2020, as we've talked about the experiences of immigrants and new arrivals from over a century ago, is certainly how can the city of Chicago and how can the United States continue to welcome these new arrivals and also provide them with a new set of skills to succeed and enhance their own communities. And it's something I think all of us could agree on, that we all might have to be doing a little bit more work going forward. But if we think about the ways in which we can create change, we have a lot to learn from those people who've joined us from all over the world.